First technique I'm going to show you is wet and wet. I'm going to start with the fluffy brown brush because it will hold more water. I'm actually going to start by getting some water from my bucket and simply painting the entire rectangle with water. No color yet. Once it is completely damp, before it has a chance to dry, I'm going to go into my color with a little bit of water, choose a color I want to use. I'm going to gently blend up the color. If I want to mix it on the palette. Try to rinse your colors between so they don't get contaminated. I'm going to use a little yellow and a little bit of green. And then I'm going to simply touch the color into that wet paper. And you can see how it's going to take the color and be a little bit crazy with it. And then you're going to let it dry. Don't overwork it. Now I'm going to take one of the white brushes. I'm going to take the white flat brush and I'm going to mix up a quantity of color. So I'm going to use a little bit of my blue. I'm using a little bit of water, gently blending it so that the color comes onto my brush. A little bit more water, adding it to my mixing palette. I'm going to add a little bit of green. It's always important to mix colors, not just straight from the container. All right, so now I have a little puddle of color. You can see how I scrape my brush on the side so that all the color is in this area. And I'm simply going to take a little bit of the color, and in this next rectangle, I'm going to paint back and forth, left to right, getting a little bit more color each time, overlapping my strokes. This is called a wash. And I'm trying to get the color to be exactly the same all the way to the bottom of this rectangle. That's why it's important to have a little bit of color already mixed. And I'm going to let that dry. Now for this next section, I'm going to actually create another type of wash. Instead of just a regular old flat wash, I'm going to do something called a graded wash, which means that I'm going to fade the color out. So I'm actually going to use the same color, might mix a little bit more blue, a little bit more green to my puddle. Again, scraping some of the color off. And I'm going to start the same way with my flat brush, paint left to right or right to left, overlapping each stroke. But here's where things start to change. When I'm ready to kind of fade the color out, instead of going back into my puddle, I'm going to rinse my brush. Might even take a little bit of the water away from it so it's not completely damp, it's not completely watery. And then I'm going to continue to paint, removing some of that excess color, drawing my brush a little bit so there's not too much water, and then continuing. You can see how the color just kind of fades into the background. This is called a graded wash, like a gradient to them. So I'm going to come down here to this last rectangle and I'm going to make what's called a variegated wash. So this time I'm going to mix up a little bit of a completely different color. Use a little bit of purple. And I'm going to mix in a little bit of red with it, just so it's a really different color. But you guys can do whatever color you want. All right, so I've got a little reddish purple. Scrape my brush off, rinse my brush, dry my brush on my paper towel. And I'm going to come back into my original color that I want as my first color. And I'm going to do the same thing, left to right, overlapping my strokes. And pretty quickly around the middle point, I'm going to stop going into this color and I'm going to come into my purple instead. And I'm going to kind of overlap that stroke. And then I might rinse my brush just to get rid of some of the green. dry it a little bit on my paper towel, come back just into the purple or your second color, whatever color you ended up choosing, and overlapping all the way to the bottom. If you get a lot of extra little bubbles of color, you can take a little paper towel and just kind of go in there. And I'm going to let that dry. I'm going to take a little bit of masking tape, and I can kind of cut it or tear it into little pieces. And wherever I place this, it's going to protect the paper. So I've got a few pieces of masking tape here. I'm going to come back in. I can do a wet and wet again. I could do a wash. I'm just going to come in and basically paint this with some orange. I haven't used orange yet. I'm going to do a little orange wash. You can see how that color is not going to touch where my masking tape is. I'm going to do another flat wash in this space. Again, just remember overlapping your strokes. Coming back in here for more color. And then trying to make sure that your color is even and smooth. Rinsing my brush and letting that dry. Now, if I make a mistake, this is one of the techniques in this section here. It's called blot. Take a little piece of my paper towel, and I can simply go back into it and blot up any mistakes I make, or if I want to create kind of a little bit of a texture. You can see how that removes some of the color. And let that dry. Okay. So now that I've given my paper some time to dry, I'm going to come back in and do a few more things. So in this rectangle here, this is called wet on dry. In order for this to work properly, I may need to make sure that my paper is already dry. So that means I shouldn't feel any coolness. It shouldn't be shiny, and it is actually ready to go. So this means that I'm going to need to mix up some color, and I want it to kind of show up over the top of my previous wash. So I'm going to add a little bit more color to my little mixed palette here. Notice that I'm using my smaller white tip brush. This gives me some control over what I'm going to paint. So I want my paint to be fairly what we call juicy, which means it has a lot of pigment mixed into it, but it's still fluid. There's still enough liquid that it can flow. And I'm simply going to paint over this area with whatever I want. And you'll notice that wherever I put the paint is going to stay there because the paper is dry. If I wanted to do trees, for example, for our landscape, I could do little lines and then little dots to kind of create the feeling of like a pine forest. And notice that my paint is still pretty thin. It's not super thick, so I'm still getting some of that transparency that is an important feature of watercolor. If I wanted to do other kinds of trees, I could do the trunks still, or like maybe give it a few branches. And then again, the dots kind of to create these types of leaves, like the suggestion of leaves. And the nice part about this is because I have that wash behind it, you know, I'll have some color to help contrast with my trees. I might even give it a little kind of overlapping layers to make it look like a little landscape. I'm adding a little bit of yellow into this. So as it gets closer to the front, it's going to get a little bit brighter in color. Okay. So that's the wet on dry. The next technique I'm going to do is lift off, which is going to come down to this rectangle here, and it's also now dry. And again, this is a sort of a similar technique to the blot, but it usually is when my paint is already dry. I can come back in with a damp brush and actually re-wet a very specific area, almost like I'm scrubbing, and simply press my paper towel into that area, and it will pull away the color where I painted. So I can create like a design this way. Make a little circle. For the landscape, this could be a really good way to add things like highlights to a mountain. I could actually draw on top of this and remove the color from an area that's already been painted. So that's the lift off technique. Next is dry brush. And this is actually where you really do want very little water on your brush, very concentrated paint, and you essentially can draw on the dry paper. And you want it to be kind of, brighter or darker. You really want to create the feeling that you have close-up things like flowers or plants or leaves. Another way you can do this is taking a dry flat brush, kind of separating out the bristles a little bit, and when you dip it into your color, it'll kind of create this. Might need a little bit drier than that. I don't want it to be very wet, so I got to kind of play around with the moisture content using my paper towel. And then separate those bristles just a little bit. So when I paint, it kind of creates almost like the feeling of grass. Okay, so that's the dry brush. Okay. Now let's go back into my masking area and see what happened when I remove the tape. You'll see that it leaves the paper behind. Like for example, I could put another piece of tape over the paint. And do another layer, maybe with some yellow this time. And you'll notice that it's going to change the color of those areas that I masked. And once it's dry, I can remove that mask and leave those areas orange.